guess when it comes to, the actual, I would say like actually building the marketplace and, overcoming the chicken and the egg or the cold start problem that we all face, how did you do that kind of in the early days? And, also too, like, did you constrain to, to one city as kind of like a hyper local marketplace or?
Yeah. So, but then what you're asking is the most important question. So that's a good transition into year two. Year two was all about scale, and it was the hardest year ever. Back to this chicken and the egg problem. So, I think sometimes I saw this with more technical co-founders. I'll pick on them a little bit. And it was only because that's who we saw in the market at the time. There was two other apps that had raised millions of dollars. We had only raised 100,000. And they would say, hey, we're this local marketplace, but we're all across the country. And one, their app wasn't great. So I was like, okay, it's probably great engineers, but the design sucks. Two, they're not focusing on the problem. So when you're building a marketplace, what's the most important thing? Liquidity. It better work. If I post something, somebody better buy that dang thing or it's worthless. So I used to get out in the car and at this point, we had like a small office. I would go buy stuff. So imagine a room like this with like 5 guys in there coding and just stuff everywhere. That's how it was for a while. I would buy it, but I'd never say I worked at OfferUp. I was just faking it. I'd tell people, oh, I'd buy a bench and I'd offer up the best thing. All my friends are using it. Complete crap. It was just a lie. And because I was trying to get it to work here in Seattle. And so, we did that for a while. And I always say in the beginning, you need to think about what's your number one metric. So think of it as just a big funnel, right? You're bringing all these people in and you're trying to get them to convert. You optimize everything for that. So instead of going broad across the country, I was trying to calm my team down. And one day I go to the map and I blew up this big map of Seattle. And I said, here's our office. Here's 30 miles. I do a circle around the office. I said, if we can't win in this circle, we're done. So let's get after this circle. And so we did everything we could and we ran experiments and we just kept hitting that thing for quarters on end. And eventually we got invited to the Facebook mobile beta for mobile ads, like in the beta. And so my co-founder, he's like, hey, you want to do this? I look at him kind of defeated. I'm like, we barely have any money. How about $50 a day? Let's try it. And we were getting installs for a dime. And so before I knew it, let's spend more. So within like 60 days, it was all the kind of metrics a venture capitalist would want to see. Liquidity was happening. Repeat usage was happening. Word of mouth was happening. I always wear my OfferUp clothes. And I'm walking around town and people are like, oh, I love that app. Like within 60 days, that's what happened in Seattle. So what we did then is we said, okay, let's expand the circle. So now we went to like 50 miles and it's kind of working. Oh, by the way, we were also heavily focused on women. And part of it might have been my own, where I was in life and watching my wife talk with her friends. It's just the amount of stuff once you have kids entering your house it's a process. And so, so I would do things in the branding that kind of skewed towards women. Like the logo used to have like a daisy on it, right? I try to make it a little bit more feminine intentionally. But every now and then we were marketing to women, and every now and then I'd see men come in and I'd message them and say, hey, work at OfferUp. Like, how did you hear about this? Like, oh, my wife uses it. Right. So now that's kind of happening. So we were able to show in year two, we were very focused and we spent all year in Seattle. So here we are 2 years into the business. We're still only in Seattle. And so I think nowadays you could actually move faster probably. Keep in mind, we were very early on mobile and we were very early on geo-targeting Facebook. Now you can probably do it faster, but I also still think it takes a while. I encourage entrepreneurs in the early days, get your playbook right before you go anywhere else, because it's expensive once you start to move into other markets. So once we figured that out, probably within like 60 to 90 days of really good metrics, we ended up doing our Series A, which was about 2.8 million. And then it was off to the races. And then it was market. Then we just kept entering markets like you wouldn't believe. And that was the game changer. But it was the discipline, I think, in the first 2 years to think about the strategy, to get the product right, to get and also to be quiet. So when Andreessen Horowitz invested, no press. And they're like, what are you doing? Mark's going to tweet about you. No, don't tell anybody what we're doing. And so what we were doing was going around the country without any serious threat of competition. We were worried about Amazon. And we also waited, by the way, to launch in the Bay Area and New York. Intentionally. We did not want to tell anybody what we were doing. So here I am. Once we started to get more traction, I go down to the Bay Area and people are like, you must not be that big a deal. No one really uses you down here. And I'm laughing. I'm like, you should see LA right now. LA is just blowing up. And by the way, a third of the adults in LA today use OfferUp every month, a third. And so like no one's even close, not even Facebook's not even close to OfferUp in LA. So I think these are important strategic things as you're thinking about scaling your business in the early days. Think through like those metrics and optimize everything for it. And so that's kind of the early days. Like I said, the discipline in the early days, and luckily all those things panned out strategically. And now we're the largest standalone local marketplace in the U.S.
Yeah, no, it's definitely pretty incredible that, the sense of scale that you're at today. I guess on another note, it's, in regards to constraining, initially locations, but what about categories? Did you initially kind of, focus on specific categories and kind of think about expanding out from there, or?
No, we always had all the categories kind of as an option for posting, but we mostly focused on geography and let that figure itself out. I mean, in our case, because we were a geo marketplace, local, we just said we'll focus on that. But I remember the first time I saw a car. I remember the first boat I ever saw. And so sometimes I think what I observed was once a car was on or something else was on, I think people were browsing and go, oh, I could post a boat on here. And then they would post a boat on here. And so I do think if you're, for those that are listening, that are doing marketplaces that are focusing on various categories, the more you can constrain in the early days, the better. And it doesn't mean you're giving up on the bigger idea, but you got to get liquidity working. You got to get retention working. You got to get word of mouth working. And so the more you can get that flywheel moving by trying some of the things I'm suggesting, I think the faster you'll get moving. But it's hard. Building marketplaces in the early days, the chicken and the egg is really hard.